Yes, hello again. Welcome back once more to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel here on YouTube, where of course we continue to rediscover more of those old school vintage dirt bikes from back in the day. Now, a quick hello here to all the new subscribers who have just recently signed up to my channel, and especially to all my American subscribers, where I'm led to believe that this channel is becoming very popular over the other side of the pond. So a quick hello here to all my American visitors and YouTube subscribers. So coming up next, we're going to go back to the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and as I said, there was many makes and models of machines that were at the 2022 show this year, and we're going to take a look at another one of those bikes now. So let's dive straight into that video and take a look at this 1979 SWM 370 motocross machine. And so as we take a look at another vintage race bike from the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, this featured 1979 SWM RS370 was once again another one of those nice bikes that were on display and actually advertised for sale at the show. And although it was posted as being a 1979 bike, it also stated that the bike had undergone a full restoration just recently. Although whether the bike was actually sold during the 2 days of the show, I'm not entirely sure, but I do have the seller's contact details if you think that he or maybe even she may still have the machine if you're interested in buying. But if, like me, you're an SWM virgin and know absolutely nothing about these bikes, I'll endeavour to try and fill in some background on their history. Now, it's said that SWM were founded way back in 1979 by Piero Cironi and Fausto Vergani, who lived in Milan in Italy at that time. Now, they both began by building small capacity enduro bikes that used the small German Sachs engines before then moving on to larger enduro and trials bikes with these hugely successful Rotax motors. But SWM, or Speedy Working Motors to give them their full title, were very successful from their very first year of manufacture, as they won an international enduro event first time out in that 1971 year. And just a year later, Italian rider Afro Rostignoli won the Italian Motocross Championship in 72 on an SWM machine. So straight away and right from the crate, SWM bikes were very highly competitive. Although these SWMs might not be too familiar to you if you live in the likes of maybe the USA, but during the late 1970s and early 80s, these SWMs were certainly the staple diet for any European rider who wanted to race motocross or enduro bikes during that 70s and 80s period, because they did have an excellent steel tubular chassis and adequate suspension on the front and the rear. But the best part of this bike was, of course, that two-stroke Austrian-made Rotax 370 engine, which wasn't only powerful and compact, but very reliable and almost unbreakable. Now, I'm quite sure that you're already aware Rotax in the late 1970s and early 80s were supplying these two-stroke motorcycle engines to off-road motorbike manufacturers around the globe, and depending on which manufacturer they were supplying their engines to, normally they would then cast their own logo onto the engine's side casings, as we see here for SWM. But as I said, these Rotax motors were also used in the likes of the Can-Ams and Italian-made Puch bikes of their day, and even the German-made Kramer used a variation of this engine with also the British bikes of Cotton EMX, and even the great CCM race bikes of 1979 and 1980 also used this tried and trusted power plant. And that's exactly the reason that these Rotax engines were so popular back in the day, because they were relatively light and they had plenty power and could take all manner of abuse, and they were basically as tough as old boots, and that's why everybody wanted them in their chassis, because they were perfectly suited as a motocross or enduro motorcycle power plant. And for a simple, compact 5-speed 2-stroke motor for the late 1970s, you just couldn't go wrong with one of these engines sitting in your off-road chassis. Now, they say that the stock exhaust system on this 1979 SWM was a completely redesigned part from the earlier SWM 1978 model, and it certainly looks the goods here in its nice shiny new paint job after its recent restoration. And again, the bike's rear silencer has also had the very same restorative treatment, and it looks even better than it did when it left the SWM headquarters in 1979. So as we move on to the front end of our Italian stallion, now because this was an Italian-made bike, you'd expect it to be fitted with locally produced motorcycle parts, and in our case here, it's a pair of Italian Marzocchi forks and triple clamps that are bolted onto our SWM. And once more, and as in the case of the Rotax engine, Marzocchi were also supplying their suspension systems to all manner of bike manufacturers during the 1970s and 80s. But once more, these Italian Marzocchis were quite good suspension systems for their day, and they were perfectly suited to our SWM with their old school front and rear drum brakes, which again, despite them being a little bit antiquated and old-fashioned for their day, they still did an excellent job of pulling up our 370 motocross machine. Now, please feel free to correct me here if I'm wrong, but as I remember about these 370 SWMs, they had a quick release rear wheel whereby you could simply loosen and remove the rear wheel nut and spindle, and then take out the rear wheel, leaving the chain and sprocket attached to the rear brake backplate, because I think the rear hub, as I recall, on these bikes was fitted with Cush Drive rubbers, but it was a great idea at the time and very helpful if you were doing an enduro event and you needed to change the wheel quite quickly. And so as we move on to the rear of our 370 SWM, we have a pair of remote reservoir rear shocks, which I'm sure for 1979 would have been a pair of Italian Corticoso suspension units. And I have to say that these shocks that are fitted to our 370 here certainly look like the factory fitted originals, but it has to be said that these Corticosos weren't exactly the best suspension units on the planet for an off-road bike, and it was quite common for new owners of these SWMs to just ditch these in favour of a pair of much better quality units. Now, as you'd expect, just about all off-road motorcycle manufacturers of the late 70s and early 80s were now using plastic fuel tanks on their motocross and enduro machines, and these of course were much lighter and much cheaper to produce than either steel or more expensive alloy, and SWM were certainly no different in that respect. And this plastic fuel tank here usually held more than enough premix two-stroke fuel for even the longest of motocross or enduro events. But of course, on any motocross or enduro off-roader, having a decent seat is more or less essential to help you soak up any bumps that maybe those Corte-Cosa shocks couldn't cope with, and these SWM seats had just the right combination of firmness and support that you needed to try and alleviate the punishment on your old aging back. And once again, up front on our SWM, we have a pair of modern style Renthal handlebars with a pair of good quality Magura ball end levers and their associated lever covers as well. Now, because this is an Italian bike, more Italian components were used, like this Tomaselli side pull throttle gasser, but the Italian Tomaselli Motorcycle Components Company supplied many of these smaller parts to all manner of Italian motorcycle bike builders in that 1970s and 80s era. Now, once again, as I remember, for 1979, it was the Italian Acerbis Motorcycle Company who supplied all the plastics on these SWMs, and whether these items here are still the originals, I'm not entirely sure, but they certainly do look authentic and correct for this late 1970s motorcycle. Although our particular SWM 370 here was just one of the many SWMs that were on display at the 2022 Telford show, and although the owner of this bike had the machine listed as a 1979 model, I still think that this could be a 1980 bike, as SWM did change the colour scheme for that year from the older 1979 red and white to orange and black in 1980, although they also had the 370 Rotax motor painted orange as well. So again, I could be completely wrong in my assumption, which, as you know, is certainly not unusual for me. But at the end of the day, these Italian-made SWM 370 RS machines were still pretty good race bikes, as they had a good solid steel chassis. They had quite fair suspension on the front and at the rear, and of course a good powerful two-stroke motor. And in their way, these SWMs were typical of the kind of quality scramblers and enduro bikes that these lesser known small Italian motorcycle manufacturers were producing during that 1970s and 80s period. And although SWM did go into liquidation in 1984 and they stopped producing these kind of motocross off-roaders, they were later resurrected in 2014, and even here in 2022 they're still producing quality motorcycles with a wide range of road-going and off-road race bikes. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around that quite nice looking Italian-made SWM 370 RS Twinshocker. Another one of those stylish Italian-made motorcycles from the late 1970s. Now, coming up in my next video posting, if you like your Husqvarna race bikes, then you may find this next machine quite interesting, because this particular 1982 430 CR Husqvarna was never really a motorcycle at all at one point, and the owner and rider of this bike actually built this machine by using two scrap Husqvarna bikes. So we'll be taking a look at how this machine was all put together in my next video posting here on my channel. But until then, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well while you're riding those old vintage dirt bikes, and I hope to see you back here again very soon to talk about more vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.